Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to this morning's session. And I am really happy to have you all here because we have an amazing group of panelists this morning with insightful discussions on how to really bring together very different conceptual approaches to education, to elevate learning and to deepen learning. And I want to first introduce to you Dr. David Osher, who we're very happy to have leading this group this morning. And many of you already know who he is. He comes without need for introduction sometimes because he's been such a prominent force in education improvement and reform, and he's worked tirelessly for years on that. He's currently Vice President and Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research. And amongst other things, he's been a big voice in helping people understand the role of socio-emotional learning, school climate, and the conditions for learning. And he's here to talk to us about science of learning this morning and has such an amazing panel and has done work consulting all over the world. So we're very lucky to have him today. And I won't spend any more time introducing. I will let you hear from David. Thank you so much, David. If you could unmute David, that would be great.
Be great. Okay, here we go. Share screen, and here we go. We will about to begin. Let me just. Okay, I think we have it correctly here. All right. So good morning, everybody. I want to first thank Andrea for the very, very generous introduction. Let me say that even though I will introduce the panelists, it was Michael and I together who first created this panel, and also in consultation with Pam Cantor, who presented with us last time, and Zaretta, who presented with us both times. And I would say the same for everybody here. I have learned so much from the people. You know, some like Michael I have watched and known for 3 decades. Others like Zaretta, I fell in love intellectually when I read her book, and then even further when I had the first chance to meet her. And Santiago through the book, and then meeting him, and Vicky through her great work. And let me just add that the people who are presenting, who I've just listed, and in this order, and this presentation builds on a previous session. It is not at all redundant with it, that was done in February, that Pam Cantor and Zaretta and Santiago and I, as well as a colleague from the University of Limpopo, Masha Papalana Thamani, did regarding using the science of learning and development as a disruptor of structural inequalities across the world education systems. And we're continuing that conversation this time, really focusing, building still upon the same book, and our publisher, Taylor Francis, has made available again for this coming week, starting today, free copies of both the last chapter to the book that Pam and I wrote, that is talking about bringing the science of learning and development into this decade, and really addressing key issues that we're talking about, and Zaretta's wonderful chapter. And so you can get that for free. And if you want to purchase the entire book, they're making this discount available. And I would just say that what I like as most about the book that we're building on is not just the fact that Pam and I did it, but we had authors of the caliber of Zaretta who really pulled together the importance of these issues. In the last session,
David, before you begin,
yes,
if you could hit presenter view for the rest of us, we'll see.
Oh, that would be great. So how do I do that now?
In my screen, it is in the lower corner here. It looks like slides move over.
All right, so let me see how I do this. Okay, I apologize for everybody. I may have other accomplishments, but it's not mastering this stuff. Okay, presenter. I have to go out of this, I think, to do with this. Okay.
Or if you, David, if you go to the bar on top, there's one that says slideshow. You can select that. If you see the bar on top.
All right. All right. I have something here that's interfering. All right. Let's go here. Slideshow. Got it.
Thank you.
And
then
you
okay
choose,
now?
if you click on it, there you should have, yeah, from current slide on your left, underneath on your left.
Okay.
There's a,
yes.
so just click from current slide,
Yeah, go back to the top.
Oh, start.
There you go.
Okay. Am I okay now, folks?
Not yet. Go ahead and just go ahead.
If you move the cursor up to the icon that says from current slide and click on it.
Oh, I see it. Finally. All right. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. And we have modeled, at least in Santiago's coaching of me, what is necessary to scaffold people. Of course, we all succeed when we have the supports and not necessarily when we don't. Okay. When I talked last time, I mentioned robust equity. And here, this time, I want to introduce you to the concept of robust equity and to tell our global participants that when, with others, I started to pull these ideas together, many of the people in the global South and North influenced me. I'd say to pull out people like Paulo Freire and Sens, both of whom started in the global South and moved at certain points in their life to the global North, but I think have maintained that focus. But also work that OECD and UNICEF has done in terms of trying to really think about the nature of equity, just giving you some examples here. And anyway, the construct of robust equity is the ability to thrive in all life's domains: social, emotional, cognitive, physical, economic, spiritual, and environmental. And we know during these last 2 years about how environmental thriving or ill-being affects us no matter what. To thrive individually and as part of a group. To thrive in the moment, but over one's life. And thriving builds upon objective and subjective well-being, but that's the flaw. And ultimately, it really requires the ability to embrace life, enjoy life, and to be able to shape the world so it can be better for yourself and others, to be agenic and be grounded. So let's go to the next slide. Here we go. Robust equity requires eliminating and combating institutionalized oppression and privilege and its manifestations in how we think, how we act, in those tools and resources that affect us, in something that Michael has really done a lot in his work, in incentive structures. Are we being incentivized to do the right things, or are we being incentivized to really do things that does not bring out the best in us? It requires transforming structures and institutions and building new settings and structures when necessary. And you're going to hear about that in part from Vicky, and as well as in terms of what Zaretta is talking about. It involves building upon the science of learning and development, which we talked about last time, and I'll draw a little upon now, but also what we know about how you make things happen from implementation science. And that's a word that really I'm using broadly right now, but it really incorporates some of the things that Michael has worked on for years with people, with somebody who mentored him and mentored me, Matt Miles. And at the same time, I've been working in how do we make the stuff happen in real life? And how do we, just like Andrea and Santiago did for me, provide supportive conditions that people can develop, as well as developing individually and collective competencies and assets. There's a dynamic relationship between those conditions and competencies that we develop. And all of us ultimately benefit from both. But the more you need something, just like I did, the more you need the support that Santiago came so that we could succeed. And that makes, I hope, this webinar better for you. Robust equity really entails expanding our conceptual and operationalization of every domain. We have to stretch them up and down. And I'll talk for a second as I move on to Michael about deeper learning in that way. But it also means understanding and leveraging the interconnections between and across domains, both in the moment and over time. When Mary Helen Imadino Yang says, I feel and therefore I learn, she's really talking about something we know. And when we know how hard it is to perform when we're feeling ill, we can just imagine what it's like for people who have hunger with them all the time and how that affects the ability to learn. In terms of what we sometimes call the cognitive domain, and in terms of deeper learning, that's an example of what I'm talking about, but we could look at any domain. But deeper learning is more than shallow learning, even though it's really important. And it's more than adaptive learning. In contrast, it is transforming learning. It is transformative. It's not just narrow learning, it's holistic learning. And it's nurturing it and connecting the interconnected mind, body, and spirit, and doing it in a manner that is humanizing. These things all come together, and these are just not new ideas. In terms of the Global South, they've been real for a long time. I once was the dean at Springfield College that traces the history of the YMCA, where we believed in mind, body, and spirit. That's one of the reasons I moved the School of Human Services that focused on community work there, because it was about mind and body and spirit. But it's also important to develop analytic, synthetic, and creative skills. And that means aesthetic opportunities. It means other types of expressive opportunities. It means the ability for people to play and learn through playing. And there's lots of examples coming out of work in the Global South that we can learn from in the Global North, like the work that Right to Play has done. An expanded notion means when we think about learning sessions, we need to think about the opportunity that everyone deserves for awe, for wonder, for passion. Vicky, I once met some of your Colombian colleagues, and I don't know if they knew you, even though I talked to them about it, but who are doing wondrous work, really trying to support people's thinking by connecting the environments to people's learning. And we know empirically that people learn better and perform better just when they're surrounded by green space. Building connections between and among people and embracing diversity while understanding the differences and uniqueness. And again, I think we'll hear this in Vicky's work, among others, and developing a sense of responsibility and critical consciousness, along with the resources, the ones that make us agentic, so we can act on this knowledge. And I think I have, no, there's one more slide. Okay. I've really done this before, but I want to add that one example of the connections is the forthcoming volume of Review of Research and Education, that the announcement for which came out last night, so you may be the first to have it, and particularly global audience and part of this network, we would love you to be able to propose things that you would want to do that are relevant. But this is part of a 2-volume series that the AERA committed to, and the second volume that will be done in 2025 is about robust equity. These two things are interconnected, and in what follows, we will hear from everybody, starting with Michael, both about the interconnections, but how we can further expand each other's ideas. And in the end of the session, how you will help us expand these ideas. So Michael, to you.
Okay, David, thank you very much. I'm going to just talk for about a minute before I flip to the slides. I have 12 minutes, and then David and I have 10 minutes to interact. I first want to say what our work is about. It is about this agenda, but it's about transforming systems in real time. That is to say, whatever the system is, and it's got to be sizable. And it is not about top-down change. It's about bottom and middle up, but it is system transformation. And I just want to give an example of, to make sure that we're talking about always reality. We, in February, our team signed a partnership with San Diego County Office of Education. San Diego County has 42 districts, has 1 million students. 500,000 of them are in free reduced lunch. And the goal in the next 3 years, in partnership with that system, is for our team, Santiago is on our team, and them to learn together, but also to implement together. So let's shift over. I think, David, you need to take away your slides, because I'm going to put on mine.
Stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, David needs to stop sharing. Okay. This is just, I've got some similar number of slides to David. And remember, the emphasis is on transformation and on in real time. That is 5 years, 3 years, but with real combinations. And so I'll be glad to follow up on this, but I want to start with this because a lot of what I'm talking about is how to connect the people who are implementing or dealing with practice, how to connect them to the sold ideas from day one, how to actually work together on that. And so Jal Mehta, who many of you will know from Harvard, sociologist, they did a book, he and Sarah Fine, on deep learning, where they 4 or 5 years ago went out and looked at a bunch of schools that were supposedly doing strong advanced innovation and learning. And they spent 2 full years, a lot of field work. And remember, these were chosen schools, innovation-based schools. And basically, they didn't find much. In fact, their book was called In Search of Deep Learning, a fabulous book, won the Grawemeyer Award. But a fabulous book because it said, supposed to be there, it isn't there. And then what they found was snippets of it that they were able to pull forward. So Jal is now actually partnering with us to try to figure out where do we stand in 2022 and how do we move forward. I did a short op-ed a couple of weeks ago called 6 Reasons for Being Optimistic About Learning in 2022 Forward. One of them is the knowledge-based, referring to what we're dealing with today. But you see in this yawning gap, Jal portrayed this, and he did a special issue, he and Amanda Datnow of the American Journal of Education. They invited, this was after his book, invited examples of what was being done and research-based examples. And they asked Larry Cuban and I to comment on it. The whole issue is, I know, January 2021. It basically says they're supposed to be happening, but it's not happening. And here, and this is our depiction as well as Jal's, that it's just not connecting to where the students and teachers and communities are. That connectability early on is the issue. So I want to go to the sold model, and these require a lot of different discussion, but I'm going to say that it has nailed the what, and even some of the descriptive how, but it is describing what the themes are, what the groundedness has to be. And David has groundedness, sense of identity. He has agency. It's all in there. But I'm going to say the big question is, how do you activate it? How do you activate it on scale? And certainly Zaretta does some of this, and we'll be interested in that. What is the theory of change? I guess I almost want to say there's a theory of what should change, and then there should be a theory of changing. How do you actually go about change? And our model basically is joint determination, collective transformation, and a culture of accountability in action where we both learn together. I'm especially interested in how to get started, how to connect to the motivation and purpose. This is repurposing education. This is about how do you really, from the beginning, and in our case, San Diego County, just to take that one, how do you connect to students, community members, teachers, parents, in a way that they say, it's not a yawning gap anymore. This is what we want to do, and let us be there. Let us do this together. And it's the startup that's absolutely the hardest. I think the emotional connections to the practitioner at that startup is key. It's in the sold model. So is my 4th point there. Deep purpose and motivation is well stated in the model. But I'm saying, does it get lost in the complexity as far as the initial start of this, and then the rapid expansion and transformation that will be required. This has to be on bigger scale, not just a few schools. It's got to be the system. Our model is landing on the student as central change maker. That is learner change maker in partnership with community and school. And in this old case, David has a great chunk on student agency. We mean student agency plus transformation work, learning to change. We call it change the world, engage the world, change the world. So it is about deep learning. And then this big one that we worry about ourselves, and we all do, how to avoid superficial implementation. I remember a great article in the old days that was by Charters and Jones. It was on the neglect of the independent variable. But in the course of that, they said, there's a great risk of appraising non-events. If something is supposed to be happening, people say, yes, we're doing it. And then you look closely, but they're not doing it, but someone's evaluated it. You can't interpret that evaluation. So this is all about the nitty gritty of transformation. I want to make this distinction. Simple change is just implementation. Ron Heifetz said about this, the technical implementation, and amounts to tinkering. Complex change is transformation, real transformation. And those are the three elements that we tend to think about. We tend to think about the young playing a major role in this. This is our full model. Obviously, I'm not going to explain the detail, but there's not that many pieces to it. The bottom foundation is the new purpose. It is about robust equity. It's about deep learning. It's about the global competencies. And I think the difference in deep learning definition, incidentally, is the SOLD model. Deep learning is in the core of social, emotional, and cognitive development. In our model, deep learning is the whole thing. It includes the core, but you see those pieces, the new purpose. If we jump to the center, it's 6 global competencies. Those competencies are supported by great pedagogy, partnership to the learning environment. They're surrounded by the conditions that have to be done to enable it. And once again, I want to say joint determination is key from the beginning, both external and internal, and that collective transformation is key. This has to be self-conscious transformation, and then the culture of accountability is grounded. So this is some elements of it, that part of the model I just showed. The deep pedagogy incorporates these 4 things. In the SOLD model, you will see each of these 4 well spelled out, each of these 4 parts of the learning design. And then this is just a new slide we just did. It's probably not so literal. I don't want to pile on the students' role that much, but as we do the 6 C's and those other things in the model, we are partnering with students who are partnering with teachers and community. And a lot of things are going to do to not only, it's robust equity in David's terms. It really is robust equity, which is getting out of poverty. It is deep change. It's dealing with the cultural history, the things that Zaretta looks at. It's big and it's deep, but it has to be like this. And then 2 final slides. Elusiveness of system change. We're working in a few countries on this. We definitely don't define it from the top down. We define it from the bottom and the middle up. And we actually want to have students, teachers, and others at the local level self-conscious, individually and collectively, about what they're doing, what the system is doing. And I really do think of them as system players, self-conscious. Once it gets going, it's systemness, not a real word, but one that I use. And this is about this system that we now, the only chance we have is if we team up with people in the system at all levels, especially the bottom and the middle, and self-consciously, mutually make this happen. And the next 5 years, the next 12 years, absolutely crucial. So I'm going to stop there, and David and I are going to, get rid of my screen, and then we will, David and I have a little chat here. Clearly, David, I said a lot, so when I'm implicated you and sold, so I will want to build on that. I'm sure you're churning to say that, but really the basic question is, now that you've mapped out the territory, how do you envisage that system change actually will get started, let alone be successful?
Yeah. First of all, Michael, I agree with, I would say, every word you have said. Okay, and I think I would say that in this case, that is defined work that I have been trying to do, as well as what I keep on learning over the last 50 years. Okay. And in fact, when I first found Freire, and I'd already been doing some work like him, and I'm not saying I'm like him, but just like him, to me, Freire's work is really about addressing that yawn. It is about how do people who come from places of some privilege end up collaborating and ultimately creating a place of voice for people who come from cultures where there isn't language, so that we can really do that. And so I think what you're saying, A, is very important. B, I had always wanted not it to be necessarily a part of the current SOLD agenda. We had to maintain a focus, but there has to be a theory of action that really also is separate from a theory of how do individuals change, even though one would want to apply that theory of people change to the theory of action. And I think you both do it, and not just at a theoretical level, but at the level of action, which always also includes to take a word that Freire actually learned from people in Guinea-Bissau who were working and struggling, to enable people to appropriate. Because in every context, people do things differently. And that's why one really needs not just the middle up, middle down, sandwich that you've talked about for decades, but at the same time, the ability to really adapt in the local space, which means families and practitioners, but most particularly in the case of learning, young people have to be the drivers, because ultimately it is the learner who best understands what she or he needs. And it's only when the learner has the types of goals that you're talking about, when you say, Michael, let us have these goals and let's develop these goals together, that it can make sense for her or him to help shape the learning, and for them, because I think it's also a group process, to help shape the learning. And to me, my interest in social and emotional learning first came because I wanted people to have the skills to both work together, but also to have people who are struggling with all sorts of oppressive conditions, to be able to not ignore, but act on those conditions, but be able to act on those conditions so you can change in the moment. Okay, so I've taken a lot of words to say I'm in full throttle agreement. And I think in a lot of ways, the rest of this panel, as well as you, further elaborate this. So I pass it back to you to respond.
Yeah, just briefly, because we want to hear from the other panel, but we wouldn't be this far if it wasn't for the work you've done the last 10 years, let's say, or what the book represents. So I'm excited by it because it gives us that agenda. When we go about implementing it, some of the details of the theory will change because it's got to be jointly modified. And I'm really interested in, as we go the rest of the panel, and this is deliberate on our part, is when we hear from Zaretta and Vicky and Santiago, that we will learn some things in the latter case from the South. Power, the role of power, for example. How will this come together? So very different elements of transformation. And there will be more and more mutual learning between the South and the North. I'm thinking, for example, Latin America and North America. But this is an exciting inflection point, turning point, but it's an action point. And I know you agree with us, and we have a lot more to learn too about the themes that you've developed and about the action part of it. So this is where it's going to get difficult, but I really do think this is deep equity. This is changing the face of poverty through development.
And let me just say two more things, Michael. One is the fact that just as you have learned from my colleagues and me, I have really learned from you, as I had shared with Michael a while ago in a blog I did on robust equity. I talked about work we were doing in Austin, Texas on culturally responsive restorative practices, and talked about the implications of a piece that Michael and Matt Fullan did in 1992, which really talks about change as a process. And it's not just one moment, it's an ongoing piece. And I think that is just so hugely important. And just to say what my colleagues and I are doing in this moment right now is we are developing, and in the last webinar, Pam Cantor talked about a playbook that her colleagues and she had done on how to implement the science of learning and development in design. We developed a rubric to try to simplify that, but even the rubric, particularly in this moment of crisis, is very, very hard, I think, for people to immediately grasp. So we are now working, a school superintendent and I are working on a one-pager about what do you do in the moment. And the metaphor that I'm giving is, even if people feel that they're on the Titanic and they're running for the lifeboats, you want them to run for the lifeboats in a way that helps them get to the landing point, which means to really be doing the things immediately that are readying them for the journey. And so we always have to build in the moment, and we can always act no matter what in the moment as well as over time, no matter how horrific the conditions are. You know, Viktor Frankl said that even at that moment when you're dying, you can choose how you die and how that affects things. And I think it's really important to know that we can always act intentionally. And the purpose of the webinar and things like that is the science of learning and development is not fixed. We want to learn, and we want to learn from the people who are in the audience today, and hopefully who will contribute to the volumes as well.
Good. We have 1 more minute, so last point. I agree.
You get it.
And I've seen parts of the playbook. It's fantastic around child learning, for example, child development. It's still not the theory of changing. It's the theory of what should change, the elements.
Right.
So we're all worried about superficial implementation. We think there'll be great adoption of these ideas, but we think there'll be slippage, lack of depth. And that's the big worry. And if we can focus on lack of depth and think about what does it mean to get depth, you can't get depth from external sources. You have to get joined up forces with the internal people doing the work. And that's why I'm so excited about this panel and where we go from today.
Right. And to sneak in 30 more seconds, I think you're exactly right. And the only purpose, I think, in part of the theory and research is to help create elastic guardrails that are not ones that say you have to do it this way, but also help people measure depth. And in fact, the reason why I started thinking with others about robust equity is if we're talking about equity, let's operationalize it, because all people can agree in equity and screw each other in the same process.
Exactly. Okay. I think it's to Zaretta now.
Yep.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Yeah, so many thoughts. I don't have any slides, and I wanted to kind of respond more in the moment. And just acknowledge 2 key points. The work that I'm doing here in the US with schools is really around what I would call instructional equity, cultural responsiveness, and the science of learning. How do these integrate? And I think the idea that Michael lifted up is the key one. What does it mean on the ground? Not just a theory, not what it looks like in a rubric, because everybody swears they're doing it. But what does it mean for us to actually be moving the system to a new grammar of schooling, as Joel talks about in his article, The Grammar of Schooling, which everyone should read, because I think it is a really provocative thing for us to grasp. So I acknowledge and affirm a couple of things that have been said, that indeed it is not about just more systems, more organization, the management of schooling, but how do we actually make schooling more aligned with learning? Because a lot of our students are doing school, right? And so the idea is, how then do we actually move from what we know around the science of learning to making it true within the instructional core of schooling, as Dr. Richard Elmore talks about. The teacher, the student, the content, always in that dynamic dance. But here's the thing that I have found is I've worked with educators kind of on the ground. They grasp the conceptual understanding, as Ferrari talks about, praxis, right? Conceptual understanding, informed action, critical analysis, and reflection. It's this bridge between conceptual understanding and informed action that really is the sticking point. And I think it's one of the points that you made, Michael, around the theory of changing. And I think what gets people stuck is the thing that doesn't get acknowledged. And what doesn't get acknowledged is our historical grounding in colonization, apartheid, segregation, the idea of white supremacy culture being so embedded. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, what schooling looks like is predicated on that. And the thing I think that is important when we talk about robust equity is if indeed we're centering the student as we should, because only the learner learns, then we have to acknowledge that one of the pillars of the current schooling, the current grammar of schooling is this underdevelopment of the cognitive capacity of poor students, low caste students, students of color, indigenous students. And it's the thing that doesn't get lifted up and acknowledged. So even as we talk today, we have not said colonization. We've not talked about apartheid. We've not talked about the need for cognitive justice. Two ways in which that system of oppression, we've used the words oppression, but this is back to your point, Michael, about what is it on the ground? What's the theory of change? What's the theory of changing? Two elements of oppression in education and marginalization. It are the underdevelopment of the cognitive capacity of those particular student groups and the undermining of their confidence. So this is what Dr. Bettina Love calls spirit murdering. So even as we talk about social and emotional learning, what we don't talk about is the ways in which we perpetuate spirit killing, the ways in which we perpetuate underdevelopment, not of just the cognition, but undermining of that confidence as a learner. And what we know is competence precedes confidence. So a lot of what we see right now is the tinkering that Michael mentioned is really centered on social emotional learning around the edges. Let's have 15 minutes of SEL at the beginning of class, or let's sprinkle it in. But we don't manage the emotions of learning. So again, my self-concept, if I am not a powerful learner, if I have been told because of the messaging, the societal messaging about those people, those kids, that we're not smart or you're not intelligent, you're not worthy of that investment of education, you don't have the intellectual capacity to grasp that. So you see the concentration of Black, brown, poor children in kind of these lower level educational experiences that actually predicate on a pedagogy of compliance. So in addition to talking about what we want to be true, we also have to look at and acknowledge what is true. This is where the map doesn't match the territory. Our leaning into the science of learning has to lean into it in context. How have we used the science of learning to actually perpetuate oppression? So it's really wonderful and kind of very kind of Pollyanna-ish for us to just talk about oppression and privilege, and we're going to knock that down. But it gets to Michael's point that if you don't actually know how to name it, if you don't have the social emotional standing to stand in the space to actually name and not shame or blame, but actually say this is the way it is perpetuated. And it's not individuals acting badly. It is wired into the system that in many ways is so ubiquitous and common that we don't acknowledge it, that we don't see it. Dr. Richard Elmore talked about this as the unexamined wallpaper. We walk past it so often, we don't even recognize the pedagogy of compliance. We don't even recognize cognitive apartheid in our schooling. And therefore, we tinker around the margins and leave that grammar well grounded. So any theory of change has to not just talk about, oh, we're going to talk about oppression. No, you have to stop talking and actually look at how it's seated in the system. Right. And so to me, those are really the things. So when we reposition students as the unit of change, what we are trying to do when we are focused on cognitive justice is how do we make the student a more powerful learner? So that's where cultural responsiveness comes in. So we have anti-racist, anti-blackness being upended, you know, Black being whatever the darkest group is in your community, in your region, in your country, because that is how colonization has worked. That population has been marginalized, but really thinking about how do we reposition students to be the leaders of their learning. And for a lot of those students, particularly the older they get as they go through the system, many of them have internalized these messages, that these are their own kind of cognitive microaggressions. And we don't lift up the narratives, these master narratives, so that we can actually create counter narratives, not as kind of just a growth mindset, rah-rah cheerleading, but to upend the grammar of schooling predicated on those narratives about who can learn, who is not motivated. We are not trying to end poverty for those people. We need to end the kind of oppressive pillars so people can continue to thrive like they have historically thrived throughout society. This idea that we're doing it for them is really one of the pieces that has to actually be checked, right? So even when we talk about the 6 C's, are we being paternalistic when we do that? Are we starting to not allow people their ways of being and doing and learning? Because those ways for collectivist cultures, for communities of color that have historical long histories, we need to be able to let that thrive again. It's not that we need to bring something because those people don't have it. That's another narrative. So we have to continually check ourselves, because this is the way we've talked about grammar of schooling for a very long time. So we got to lift those things up in terms of where have we undermined the cognitive capacity of students, and how do we reposition the student? Because only the learner learns, only the learner grows their brain power. And that means our job is to be the personal trainers of their cognition, to create the environments that don't allow stress from microaggressions and marginalization to actually take root and unwittingly undermine all this focus and work around equity. All right, I'll stop there because I can get wound up and keep going. I'm going to hand it over to Vicky and Santiago.
Awesome, Zaretta. Hat off. I'm left without really knowing what else to say, but I will try. Thank you very much. This is the kind of discussion we need to have, I believe. And from what I hear, first Michael and Osher say, Michael and David share, and from the engagement I've had the privilege of developing with the science of learning and development, deep learning, etc. What we see in what David and Michael are presenting is one of the most powerful developments in the field of education, I would say. I mean, in many ways, the principles of practice for of SOL, the science of learning and development, the new pedagogies for deep learning model as well, provide us with a very clear, comprehensive, compelling way to explain how and why and under what conditions powerful learning happens. And I think that's a phenomenal contribution. Now trying to build on what Zaretta was saying, one of the key implications, if we really take the insights of the science of learning and development and what Michael was talking about in terms of the vision for deep learning, for student as change agents, etc., and if we take seriously the notion of cognitive justice that Zaretta so beautifully articulated, what we come to realize is that the conventional model of schooling, the grammar of schooling that Zaretta is making reference to, is indefensible. It's rendered indefensible on the grounds of what we know about how children learn and develop, what we know about what are the conditions that foster well-being, and on the grounds of social justice, what are the conditions that allow for justice to flourish. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. It is what the science of learning and development, the developments currently on deep learning show us is that, and make clear, is that conventional schooling is now indefensible. And the big question, and Michael is posing this question, the question of the how. What's the theory of changing? How do we create models, practices, systems that bring the ideas of the science of learning and development to life in a way that enhance the learning of students, that have a focus on robust equity, and by that I mean, cognitive justice, as Zaretta is very beautifully articulating, that do so at scale, in thousands of schools across entire educational systems, and do it with results, with clear results, and that sustain over time. And the good news is that in many ways, some examples from the global South have managed to do all these things for decades. In the span of the last 3 decades, there have been phenomenal attempts and initiatives that have managed to change the grammar of schooling, to do it at scale, to change the pedagogical core, to do it at scale, to show results, and to stay alive. I'm talking right now about Escuela Nueva. Vicky will talk to us a little bit more about it, and the tutorial networks in Mexico, the Learning Community Project. And what these examples, there are many other examples. I won't kind of delve into all of them, but what they have been able to do again is to start by changing the nature of the interaction between adults and young people in the most remote communities in their countries, in their societies, with a focus on not trying to get students to catch up with the old logic of schooling, but to really create the conditions for powerful learning. And I think that's where you see equity at its best, where you're not there trying to compensate, trying to help those poor dears catch up with the old game of schooling. What these initiatives have done is to change or replace the grammar of schooling with the language of learning. What they set out to do is to create clear, concise, actionable practices and environments that allow for learning to flourish. They have not been obsessed with academic outcomes, even though they do well on academic outcomes. So what these movements have been doing is to so the key ideas around the theory of changing. They have created clear, simple, inspiring, actionable visions for teaching and learning. And they have not done this for teachers, but alongside them and alongside students as well. They have created practices, models that allow the adults in the system to learn in the same way that we are hoping the students will learn. So engaging the teachers and the educators as learners themselves. They have practiced what I call equity as solidarity. The idea is that we are not engaging with those historically marginalized and bringing the solutions to them, but developing alongside them, and with a strong equity lens, in the sense that with the basic idea that nobody is worth more than anybody else. The engagement at the pedagogical level with students, and also the engagement of the leadership of these initiatives with teachers, is one of equal grounding. No one is worth more than anybody else. And it's on that equal grounding that you can start to develop very powerful models for change, very powerful energy for change. And the other thing that I would say is these models have been able to expand at scale. They have been featured and they have been showcased by people like Dr. Richard Elmore or by Ernesto Schiffelbein in Chile as examples of the future of learning, of what the future of learning might look like if the future of learning might be bright. I will say one other element that I wanted to bring up. One thing that these models do is to maintain a very close link between design and execution. So the people who kind of envision the models take a lot of time to develop them in practice alongside the educators and students you work with, and refine the model, change it, toss what's not working, etc. over time to make sure that you have something that's really working on the ground in powerful ways. I have the hypothesis that initiatives like Redes de Tutoría or Escuela Nueva tick all the boxes in the frameworks that we saw presented by David and Michael. That's my hypothesis, and maybe some boxes better than others. But at the same time, I think that concepts like robust equity and that David talked about, and deep learning that Michael talked about, especially student and change agents, might be the areas that we can look into as leaders of Redes de Tutoría, Escuela Nueva, engaging to kind of heading towards the future, to move the work to a next stage. In terms of robust equity, I think Escuela Nueva, Redes de Tutoría have figured out how to create the conditions for powerful learning and the kind of cognitive justice that Zaretta has been talking about. But there's not much work that has been done to start changing the conditions that, to start mitigating the conditions outside of the school that affect the lives of the students. And I think there's a huge room of exciting work to do in that area. Redes de Tutoría is trying to do that right now with an attempt to expand these very powerful pedagogical practice to the 30,000 communities all over the country with the highest levels of marginalization through community and school development as well. But this is just an initial attempt. And the deep learning, to what extent is the learning that's happening in Escuela Nueva Redes de Tutoría deep? I think that's an open question. I think there's uneven implementation. And there's something that the thinking that Michael and David are presenting can help us use to examine in more detail to what extent how deep is the learning that these children are developing. But we can at least know that children who are experiencing these pedagogies that I'm talking about are outperforming. And these are the children in the most remote communities in Colombia, in Mexico, in other parts of the world. They're outperforming their more privileged counterparts, and that's something to highlight. So in many ways, we believe there's much deeper learning than in conventional schooling, but I think it's a question that remains open. I want to pass it on to Vicky now, who will be talking about Escuela Nueva and the relationship to the ideas that we have been discussing here. Vicky.
Thank you, Santiago. There we go. Before I start, first of all, I just wish that when we started Escuela Nueva, which means new school, one of the longest bottom-up innovations of the developing world that has been sustained and that has inspired educational reforms worldwide, we would have had all the significant developments of the science of learning and of deep learning. And of course, for us, it was a local innovation that became a national policy. And that the most important part, it's like a movement because children, teachers, and communities were the actors of change. I want to highlight this quote that I like very much because it says a lot of things for me and for many people. For more than 100 years, the lack of school management methods has been the cause of complaints. But it's only in the last 30 years that efforts have been made to find a solution to this problem. What has resulted? Schools continue exactly the same as before. There it is. Who said this? Comenius in the year 1600. Can you imagine that? So I wanted just to highlight that. They didn't put that there. Oh, there it is. Okay. And so I want to highlight that the LAC region has been emphasizing that to improve, especially UNESCO has been stating that to improve the quality of learning, we need a cultural change. And they say it in a complicated way. They say a paradigm shift from transmission of knowledge to socially constructed knowledge. It's a complicated way. It's just to say from teacher-centered to child-centered. But most educational reforms in the region have been administrative in nature. Here, I want to just show a little visual image of what we tried to do, which is nothing new in the philosophy of education. I think the image that Santiago had is even a better one. Escuela Nueva represents the story of Cinderella. necessity for us is the mother of innovation. We started with the most isolated, the invisible schools, the rural multigrade, to offer the most vulnerable children the right to quality basic education. For us, necessity was the mother of innovation. This is the importance of the Global South. The difficult conditions facing rural multigrade schools for an innovative and comprehensive approach to improve quality and access to children to the right to education. So Escuela Nueva's new approach to school shifted the focus of learning process from teacher-centered to student-centered, nothing new in the philosophy of education. It encouraged cooperative and collaborative learning among children, flexible promotion where children finish academic units at their own pace, a personalized support to the teacher with a new role as a mentor and a facilitator and a guide. So the learning process was supported by a system of curriculum learning guides, classroom libraries, and learning corners to facilitate student-centered inquiry and different sets of activities. We've had, I would like to show more images of Escuela Nueva. I had another image there, but I don't know if my technician is helping me out. Well, anyway, the important thing is we have had decades of research. UNESCO in the whole region compared the countries in the region, and Colombia, after Escuela Nueva was implemented in more than 20,000 schools in Colombia. Colombia and Cuba were the only two countries in the region where rural schools outperformed urban schools, except to the bigger cities, compensating for social inequalities. This is so important. And another important research finding that we had published by the University of London was precisely by the University of London, the impact of Escuela Nueva on peaceful social interaction of children. Of course, this is because cooperative learning helps them to dialogue, to interact, to reach conclusions together in a nonviolent way. And for Colombia, this is extremely important. The school governments, we have school governments to promote students' autonomy, participation, and leadership skills, as well as stronger relationships with the community. And in this way, all the 6 C's are there. We have tried to incorporate them, and we integrated curriculum, teacher training, community participation in a systemic and cost-effective way. So we needed to transform all this complexity into simple, manageable action so that all teachers could have results. As I mentioned, most reforms in the region have been administrative in nature. They're just learning how to decentralize, and this takes a lot of energy of the ministries of education. So in the Escuela Nueva, we wanted to radically transform the pedagogical core. I could have had more images. I have wonderful images of the presentations, but I wasn't too sure of how to handle all these images. To promoting the most remote and underserved communities, not only improving academic performance and social cultural skills, but in the issue of equity. It's like Paulo Freire in the classroom. Really, this is Paulo Freire in the classroom. We have tried to respond to the whole child, mind and heart, with productive instructional strategies. I read a bit about all the things you've been doing, fortunately. Student-centered, ensuring motivation for learning, 21st century skills like learning to learn, and strengthening social and emotional skills. This is one of the most important parts. And in our interventions, we have created strategies transforming the learning environments with child-friendly learning environments. Nothing new in the philosophy of education, but we just managed to do it and put it in practice. We also have something that we call learning guides. It's like a little bit of Paulo Freire in the classroom. Children they have their learning guides where they follow instructions, but basically they're the intelligent questions for promoting dialogue among children. And here we have tried to incorporate the 6 C's that you've been talking about: critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, communication, leadership, character, the social emotional skills, especially so much is around the school governments. And this is, I think, one of the most important things, because we have used the school governments, the learning corners, the learning guides. And of course, let's say we have created child-friendly environments with locally made materials of the community. And I just wanted to highlight that another aspect I want to highlight is the training of the teachers, where teachers are trained with the same methodology that they will be using with their students. In this way, we've also created a network of teachers. They themselves created a network of teachers, or what we call micro centers, where they learn more from one teacher to another teacher. So all these things that you've been saying with scientific basis, we have done it in an intuitive way, just solving solving problems day to day. And I think I wanted just to finalize it and say that one of the most important parts is that inequity. Education, Latin America, unfortunately, is one of the regions with the highest inequality. So education, according to multiple analysis, economic, pedagogical, social, it has demonstrated that it is the main instrument to correct inequalities, especially if it's of good quality and in the earlier years. As Professor Heckman has been saying, it was the main instruments of public policy that presents development and equity. And we had a study here in Colombia, because all the things I've been saying, and originally I was a sociologist, so I admire empirical evidence. And one of the most important things is that we had a study done by some of the best researchers here in the country, where they compared children of a socioeconomic level of Escuela Nueva, which are the poorest of the poor, with a higher level economic status, and Escuela Nueva, they found, compensates for social economic inequality. And this is so crucial for all the things that you've been mentioning. I just would have loved to make a longer presentation of Escuela Nueva, showing all the different images and the results. But I think the most important thing is that we can say is that, yes, it can be done. And Escuela Nueva is Pablo Freire in the classroom. Now, we have learned a lot of how to do these things, and I have learned that you have to work with governments to have impact and result, big coverage, but you need the role of public-private partnerships and the role of civil society for two issues: quality and sustainability. When I left the ministry as Vice Minister of Education many years back, and we universalized Escuela Nueva in Colombia, and then the country started, like the rest of the region, to decentralize, we said, oh my God, this is going to start falling down. So what did we do? I created a small NGO, it's called Fundación Escuela Nueva, which I'm heading right now, precisely to continue innovating and to continue creating new knowledge. So this is why for us, it's so important to learn from all of you and to link with all of you. I just wanted to highlight that now our big challenge has been migrants from Venezuela. We have 2 million migrants. So we adapted Escuela Nueva for displaced and migrant populations. So we have Escuela Nueva learning circles. They're in the cities where all these migrants are coming, and we're having fantastic results incorporating these children into the mainstream of education in Colombia. And of course, we have had, with the COVID situation, I just want to highlight that we don't have connectivity in the rural areas. So, but the teachers do have in the smaller towns connectivity. So our self-paced learning materials were crucial for the children in the rural remote areas of Colombia. But the teachers became stronger with Renueva, with the new technologies. So we have now a community of practice called Renewal, which means Renueva. And I just wanted to say that it's been fantastic because it's a new step that we've been moving forward after the COVID situation. So I just wanted to mention these things. I would love to share more things, more images of Escuela Nueva. Unfortunately, I don't have all these slides with me, but we can do it in another occasion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing, actually. It was power-packed and a whirlwind of great information and very inspiring. Thank you. I always love ending with actually seeing children in the school who've benefited too. So often we can't actually end on that note. And so it's wonderful to see that. We have a bunch of questions here in the chat. And I welcome everyone. Usually we can bring everyone in on the screen, but this was set up more as a webinar. And so we can't see all our friends who are attending, which is a shame. But I do have a question early on from Bob Weiss for David and Michael. And let me make sure I can see it. He said, very exciting to hear Michael talk about transformation in real time and activating on scale. Also, his emphasis on involving students and those in the middle. My question in achieving this is, what is the best way to incorporate the often complex science of learning that is practical and understandable to those who will be implementing? Any thoughts on moving from complexity to changing for those who will actually make it happen?
Michael, do you want to go first and I'll follow you?
Sure, yeah, it's I think we've set it up in a way that that's what we want to discover. I really want to talk much more to Zaretta, but I have confidence, and despite what she said, which I'll get to in a moment, I have confidence, and she will, I'm sure, say the same thing, that we have vastly underestimated the insights of young people, vastly, and that they do things way better than we possibly imagine. So I am, if we go in with an attitude of discovering what they have that we don't have to be able to solve problems, and that's part of the purpose, then I think we will make progress, and it will be student as change maker. I mean, they're creating the details as well, and we want them to do that. There's much more complexity in terms of handling colonization. I'd like to think, I'm worried about getting bogged down in that debate, and therefore, and so I kind of have a two-stop image that you get started, you make sure Zaretta's in the room all the time, so to speak, and that you're doing this work, but you're making progress, and you're having a friendly critic helping to make more. But if people really get bogged down in the argument, it may get stalled. That's my worry.
So here's where I want to jump in, because I think, building on kind of what I'm doing on the ground with teachers, I would say I would come at it a slightly different way. So one of the things I lift up for educators, and I'm actually going to be with a group of 200 leaders. We have a 3-part series, and we're talking about complexity. So this word, I love how you coin words, Michael, right? Helping people understand what's the small, high leverage thing you can do. But one of the things that I would say is the idea isn't that colonization is a debate. It's just a fact. Now what you have to look at, what are the elements of that? So this is kind of a type of design thinking, right? What actually needs to be prototyped given the constraints, given the pillars, particularly how they're resistant. So what I do is we don't talk about that. That's where I feel like we're getting stuck. It's a debate. There's no debate on that. What would we be debating? The reality is we need to learn by doing. So if we understand these are the things that need to happen, this is how learning happens because the science backs it up. What are we doing that's contrary to that? And where are our competing commitments? Why do we continue to do that when there's no science behind it? So I come through inquiry and learning by doing. So this is where Freire really is important, because that informed action, then you have to step back and say, why did we do that? Why did we get that result? So this is the idea of not just implementation science, but continuous improvement, right? The idea that I'm constantly looking to see, am I supporting the student in a new way? Is the student actually now doing the things? I don't do it to the student, but learning by doing. There's no debate around colonization, segregation, and apartheid. That happened. It's still happening. What we now need to do is move past the debate. People have a strong desire to actually go for robust equity, but it's the implementation gap that we see. So what will we have to do, mind, body, spirit, as well as practice, to do a new thing? That's the real question. You don't need just somebody to debate it. So that's where I would continue to say we need to actually have more robust inquiry informed with an equity lens, learning by doing, listening to the most marginalized students, not the students that are just the star students, the most vocal students, the students that are positioned for academic success in the classroom. You need to go to the students who are not having access to that. That's why I like Kathleen Cushman's work. She actually goes and says, students, tell us what it feels like for this marginalization. What's getting in the way of you actually not becoming that competent learner? How is that making you feel? And have the courage and the will to actually respond to what students are telling you. They've been telling us for a long time. It ain't like we don't have any student input. We just don't have the will to actually listen to the most marginalized students telling us what feels hurtful to them. If we are serious about social emotional learning, we will listen and not keep reinventing conversations. I'll pause there.
Okay, and
Yeah, I
I'm
actually wanted to say something too. I thank
okay,
you
and then
very much.
you do,
Yeah.
and Andrea, then I want to add my piece to the question, but you go
That sounds
first.
great. Thank you very much, Zaretta, for bringing up Kathleen Cushman actually too, because one thing that struck me when listening to all of this is that we would have to bring students' voices into the picture here in a big way. If the onus is on the learner, which is great, it's owning the learning rather than putting the onus on the learner. And I really love the distinction there, and think it is important to think about the students' voices too. So thanks. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, and I'll be brief so we can get another question as well. That I think that it is always people with lived experience in the practice world who have to drive the process, and we have to be listening. It doesn't mean they know everything, but it means they know a lot. And those of us who may know something from outside or from theory and other practice are in a role of doing that ongoing co-construction. And in fact, if we really believe in system dynamics, we both know things, but everything gets recreated in ways that we can't anticipate in the moment. And if we think about the individuality of each person and of each unique context and their dynamic nature, we have to keep on listening. And so not only are students untapped voices, but often families are under-tapped voices, and often practitioners on the ground are under-tapped voices as well. Two more things. In terms, I very much agree with what Zaretta said about it's not to go back to the language right now of colonization, but I do think it is imperative for researchers, people in power, and people who are teaching and learning to understand how those master narratives of colonialism, of deficit, of not looking at people's strengths have become part of people's intellectual wallpaper. Not just, and we have to do that. And particularly in places where people are trying to shut it down. And in the US, there are many people who are trying to squeeze it out. Even if we can't speak, it's important to have the voices of the people with the lived experiences speaking. And then if you want some examples of some of this stuff being embodied in some places that are struggling in practical terms, in a book that we did in 2018, and I'll provide the link to it on creating safe, equitable, engaging schools, we started to talk about it. The book is right now being translated into Spanish as well. And Linda Darling Hammond and I want to take those within robust equity, and over the next 2 years, look at different places that we have been working with as well, and seeing who are doing this work, just like the work that Vicky is doing, so that we can learn not the answers, but rather how one can do it. And I actually realize now that I'm going to want to incorporate also what is going to happen in San Diego, if I get in terms of that. And so we will have conversations, but that there are ways. I'll provide a link to that. And I think it's now probably time for the next question.
I think Santiago may have had a.
Oh, I'm sorry, Santiago.
Oh, no,
That would be-
I think you just wanted to say spot on, Zaretta. I think that's the work we need to do. And we can expect that it will happen. It won't happen without getting in trouble when you start to steer the pot, so that you do create environments where students who have been historically marginalized take the agency, take control over their learning. That is very subversive. That goes against the grain of how schooling as a tool for colonization, as a tool for control, have operated. So we cannot expect that this will happen without a fight, without getting in trouble. The example of Escuela Nueva is a beautiful one. Vicky Colbert, when she was in Colombia as a vice minister of education, brought into the ministry rural teachers to help lead and develop Escuela Nueva and bring it to scale. Teacher Oscar Mogollón, one of the co-founders of Escuela Nueva, he was a teacher in a small multi-grade school, and he came to the Ministry of Education to help design and develop the model. That created a lot of noise. I don't think that was an easy thing for Vicky to do, and she had to do a lot of work to protect this team because they brought a very different mindset, a very different ideology, a very different way to interact with people on the field, and that took a lot of effort. So one of the things that initiatives like Escuela Nueva have done, especially in the times when they expanded to scale, this is the case also with the Learning Community Project in Mexico, was to take institutional power, to go into positions of institutional power, but to be intentional about changing their logic. So you engage, once you get to power, you don't start to reproduce the same old way of doing things, top down, you mandate this for everybody, but you start to create a different culture. And that's something that Escuela Nueva, I think, did beautifully, which is a culture where pedagogy is at the center of what everybody does. Everybody in the system, regardless of where you are positioned, need to really know this pedagogy and practice it and model it and support its development. And what you start doing then is, yes, you pursue power, but you change its logic. And I think that's an area where we often get stuck, which is we get to power and then we just reproduce the way it has always been. And I think that's a very important thing to pay attention to.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. The conversation has been super interesting in that respects. And one of the issues is too, that how you can make that sustainable, and I think Zaretta was commenting on that. She said, my wondering, how do we move past the piecemeal approach and making significant change? And I think that is, the gazillion dollar question there. It's, how can we actually get a foothold and actually make significant change? So there was one other question after that from Camille Farrington. Building on that wondering, Zaretta, we see over and over that if people make change in only one part of a system, that the other parts will snap that change back into place. That is what systems do brilliantly. How do we maintain progress? And then Megan Hennessy followed up, how can we capitalize on the motivation of learning by doing an authentic experience to get to the deep learning? I heard from a practitioner recently that there's a concern of losing the excitement of the learner if there's too much time, depth spent on a certain concept or topic. And that's certainly interesting from the science of learning perspective too, because each of the learners is going to have a different motivation, different reinforcement rate, et cetera. So having them really own the learning in a big way is an interesting question. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I want to jump in, and I'm sure others do. This is where we really have to look at, and I think this builds on what Santiago was just saying. Our logic model of what is robust pedagogy has to shift, because even embedded in that question is the idea that I have to get every student to be motivated in a particular way, that the teacher's still the primary actor, versus being able to create an environment in which we are not over scaffolding. I feel like the ways in which students disengage is we are over scaffolding instruction. The over scaffolding of instruction creates dependent learners who now the motivation may wane. Oh, it's taken too long. I'm waiting for the teacher to take me to the next. And some kids are already ahead, some kids are behind. Versus creating an environment very much like a studio that an artist or a creative or a musician, nobody worries about that. You're working on your craft. Now, you may come together to talk about it. You may come together to learn techniques. You may come together to learn how to critique and how to get these other skill sets. And then you go back to actually building your craft. In no other domain do we ask that question. We are still of the mindset, deep mindset, that learning is lockstep. And we don't know how to create the environments, particularly if there are large numbers of Black and brown children, that may feel a little chaotic, but learning is chaotic. And there's a messy middle, and we don't position teachers to actually be the stewards of learning. We have confused covering your content with instruction. And this idea of putting grade level materials in front of students actually is part of inequity by design, because now all the teacher does is over scaffold. And teachers don't know how to let go of that. So the scariest part, and where I see the system snap back, is the teacher does not know enough about the science of learning to actually be a cognitive mediator, the personal trainer of students' cognition. We don't solve that little thing. All this other stuff is just going to be good fluff. Robust equity, SEL, safe and encouraging. We have used all those terms before, and not a damn thing has changed.
Sorry, I need to unmute myself. Thank you. David, go ahead.
Yeah, two quick points on what Zaretta just said. One from the science, in this case, I quoted before Mary Helen Medina Yang, and I think she's an incredible neuroscientist with a cultural perspective. She has pointed out that the neural networks that fire when people are being creative are the same neural networks that are firing when our minds are wandering. And we tend to be so task-oriented and production-oriented that we squeeze out that element within the school space. The other point I want to make is, as a teacher who first started out as an organizer before I was a teacher, the only times I ever was fully constrained, because I quit places that forced me to, was the times that I had, departmental directors coming in to chairs coming in to observe my teaching. And I became Mr. Overconstructed. And I say that because of the fact that in order to change the teacher space, we also have to create the conditions where teachers feel free to do it. I was once in the coffee room in Finland and listening to someone talking about taking risks, and the principal came by and said, "Oh, that's so wonderful to hear," because the teacher was giving people William Burroughs to read. She said, "That's so wonderful to hear. I want you to take risks." That's the message we have to do and incentivize, rather than we're going to hold you accountable for moving in a production in a certain way and for it to be squeaky clean. And I would add white.
Thank you, David. And Zaretta, you were commenting.
Yeah,
You were saying leaders have to center risk-taking as disruptive innovation.
So this
What
is
gets
about
measured gets done. Yeah, what
right.
gets measured gets done is interesting, actually.
These are the concentric circles of change. So if you've got in that instructional core, you have to actually be doing. This is the connection that is not being made. This is why I go back to Michael saying the theory of changing. This is the active part. We keep talking about kind of before and after as if there's no changing. What does it take for people to shift their mental models? What does it take? And what we know from change management, right? The human side of change is the way adults shift their mental models. If I come in with a deficit, you telling me to shift from a deficit to a more open belief about possibilities of learning for students of color, you telling me is not going to change that. I have to experience it. So the learning by doing, inquiry, powerful professional learning communities where they are taking it apart and putting it together. So we need to move beyond the jargon, collective efficacy, but what does that look like on the ground? It's messy as hell. And nobody has the bandwidth. If the leader does not put in their evaluation, disruptive innovation. The teacher tried, had a first pancake. We talked about it. You learned from that. If that doesn't get in the evaluation, teachers won't let go of it. Reimagining the pacing guide. That pacing guide doesn't change, not a damn thing is going to change. We are being very naive about what it takes to change, particularly when we put equity and racial justice on it.
Yes, I know we're running out of time, Zaretta. We all need to talk some more about this. I think if you take the overscaffolding, it's a problem, type of problem we've said in change, striving for complexity and achieving clutter. So you really think you're getting more sophisticated, but what you're doing is achieving clutter. And I think that the notion, the most important thing you said to me was about how confidence is undermined unwittingly or wittingly, and that going to the least marginalized, the most marginalized student, the student that is in the most difficulty, and seeing that person naturally develop, I think that has to be an eye opener for a lot of people. I don't think it's just one good accomplishment. I think it's a window into what has been missing to be able to do that. And to be able to do that, that part may not be as complicated as we make it out to be.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think also I want to go back to just one point that was made about Vicky's efforts also and Santiago's. And I think that bringing in the community leadership is really a big important part of the piece, because only the local leaders know what really needs to happen in their own schools too. So I feel like that was a very important piece in the success of the programs that we did see. And I was very interested in everything I heard today, and I'm very curious actually to hear what's next in this plan. Like, we have the model and we have a few exemplars, and then how do you keep the momentum going, and how do you make things more tractable for people who are in schools that they want to change? Anyone can pick that up.
I'd like to, Andrea, for us, it was, since we started bottom up, but we were also thinking about how to change the attitudes of people, of other teachers, and of policy level people. So we started with demonstration schools. You need visual images. This is so important in education. At least in Latin America, we just have too much rhetoric. But we needed simple visual images. So we used to take people to see what was happening, so other teachers could say, I can do it, And this is the way we started, bottom up. So it was demand driven by the teachers themselves. So it's a social process, it's a social movement also of how to incorporate and introduce innovations. And I just wanted to highlight one more thing, the family. In Escuela Nueva, anything the child learns from the national curriculum, because we have to respect national curriculums, but we just deliver them in a different way. So anything the child learns has to be applied with family and community. And this is what takes a bigger dimension. This is just fantastic, because immediately you link the child with their family and their community, and they see the importance of applying knowledge. So for us, we've tried to make things in a very simple way to facilitate work for teachers, but especially so that all these ideas that you've been mentioning can be really put into practice. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of really applying knowledge in their family, with their family and their community. And we have incorporated very simple things. So I think this is important. And of course, from the outset, we have to think systemically. In education, you have to. When you think, if you want to make changes with the child, you also have to make changes in the teacher training strategies, in the administrators, and of course, the community participation. So for us, it was a systemic approach.
I think you're muted, Andrea.
Oh, sorry. Are there any closing remarks that any of our speakers want to make? We're coming near to the end of our time.
Just very quickly, it's simple, Vicky, but it's profound. Good pedagogy is about human understanding, and we all humans are equipped to do that, to listen to each other. The problem, what makes things complicated, is that we're trying to do that in a system that's designed to stifle it. And that's going to be the big struggle.
David, are you muted?
Okay.
But you're muted.
Yeah, we are wired to learn. And I think we create structures that interfere with those wirings. And when people say that collaboration is an unnatural act, it's not. The inability to use our human bonds has been structured to make it seem in the wallpaper, again, to use Bettina Love's notion, unnatural, when it is actually, as we know, when a parent bonds with a child and when kin and clans develop, natural.
Yeah.
I would just end with that which we don't acknowledge will repeat itself.
Thank you. And Vicky,
Pardon me, excuse me,
your hand's up.
no, sorry. I'm sorry,
Oh,
it was not.
Okay, well, it could be that what Zaretta said is the perfect ending, actually. And yes, you know, children are always learning. The learner is always learning something. The question is, what is it that they're learning? And certainly some children have learned to ignore school and they've learned to shut down their learning. And so these approaches where you create environments where children are learning the things that we're hoping that they can learn and take and have them be their own into their own lives and use them as they must are the most important factors. And so I appreciate the 2 sessions that you guys have arranged. I thought it brought up a lot of great information and many questions and a huge challenge. And I think addressing that challenge as rigorously as we can is the next forefront. And I hope that at some point we hear from everyone later and hear even more on this. So thank you so much. I hope, you know, you get a big hand from the audience that you can't see. And I thank the audience for staying through the whole discussion and for the questions. So have a wonderful day and we'll close here. Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thanks.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful, thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.